Okay, well, Stephen, thank you very much for coming along this evening, and or this afternoon from your perspective, and we're very grateful that you're able to spend an hour or so with us. So I'll just introduce you to others who are here. Stephen is a professor of economics at Hope College in the US, and in addition to his teaching work on macroeconomic theory, he's always had a passion for exploring Christian thinking about economics, and he's an executive editor of the journal Faith and Economics, and he's also a fellow of the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics and an associate fellow of the Kirby Laing Centre for Public Theology in Cambridge. So, Stephen, thank you very, very much for coming again. And my first question to you, and I hope this will be a conversation and not just a kind of interrogation, so I'm really hoping it doesn't feel like that, but can you tell us something about your background and education, how you came to be where you are now?
Yes, of course. And let me start by just saying how much I appreciate the invitation to talk with you all here today. I think this will be a lot of fun, and I'm glad we could work it out in the schedule. I'm drinking tea. It's evening for you, and so I know at least one person has a glass of wine. I can't do that this time of day, but it's this is a nice break in the day for me. So I'm an economist by training. But of course, I'm a Christian by choice and by birth. So I grew up an evangelical Christian, and since then have moved toward the Reformed tradition that's very common here in West Michigan. And for my whole life, I've always been sort of haunted or nagged by the sense that my Christian convictions should have a big impact on the way I think about things all throughout my life, but in particular, the work that I do as an economist, and also the way that I model economic life for my students and for my children. So that intuition has been part of what motivated me to study economics in the first place. I became very interested in questions about poverty and education and immigration. Some of these, these big public policy questions that get people really worked up for very good reason, because they matter so much. And my sense was that studying economics could allow me to understand these questions better. Maybe even, my young self to come up with a solution, to these big problems. And that's what got me into economics, was the sense that maybe there were answers out there. So I got a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I fell in love with the academy, the reading, the writing, asking questions, working with students. I love teaching. So I've been, I never left the academy. I got a teaching job right after graduate school, and I've been, I guess I've been teaching about 15 years now.
Lovely. And I'm just thinking about my own experience, and I was a Christian long before I began to think about economics. And I suppose my introduction to having to think about economics was working in developing countries, and also doing I never finished it, but a kind of diploma in development studies, and that led me by an interesting route to the program that I'm currently involved with within Green Christian, called Join Enough, which is linking together the issues of the climate emergency, biodiversity loss, and what the economic drivers are that's creating that situation, and what's a Christian response to that.
I think there's I've gotten to know lots of Christians in the economics profession, and a surprisingly large number of them are interested in development economics. Global development and global poverty is just an issue that it just really animates Christians for a lot of good reasons. And so if there's a particular strength for our community, I think that would definitely be the one.
Yeah, yeah. And so you grew up as a Christian, you developed this academic interest in economics. What specific areas of economics have you looked at in relation to the connection between faith and the economy? What are the kind of aspects that most interest you in this area?
I mean, I was trained, as most economists are today, I was trained to just be an applied statistician for all intents and purposes. Economists, we take big data sets and we ask interesting questions. What, if we change the policy this way, what impact is it going to have? And I was trained as a labor economist, so very heavy in statistics. Once I started teaching, though, I just started reading lots and lots of things about economics and Christianity and theology. And my apologies, I think you're probably hearing my computer's giving me some alerts here, and I do not know how to turn them off. So
it's okay. It's
so
fine.
it goes. I'll ignore them if you can. The questions that really started to stand out to me were questions about wealth and poverty. But also I started digging deeply into environmental questions, and I started to see environmental questions as being this place where economics couldn't on its own guide us to the set of commitments and values that I thought were obvious, but theology could. And so in particular, when I started thinking about animal ethics and environmental ethics and climate change, I started turning to Christian theology for a story about why the world matters, why humanity matters, how God values animals and why, and what does that imply for our obligations. And these sorts of things. I mean, the economics won't supply an underlying ethics that allows us to sort of break through these really difficult ethical questions we face, but the Christian tradition is very rich in people thinking about these things very deeply, and that's where the two started to come together for me. I'm interested in everything, but that was like one of the first touch points, at least.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, in terms of the different disciplines of theology and economics. I mean, are they very different? Is it difficult for you to approach both disciplines at the same time? And how difficult is it to be interdisciplinary in this area?
At a light level, it is not hard. So I would say that it's not hard for a Christian to learn about economics. Nor is it hard for an economist to be a Christian. But to take these very different kinds of knowledge and areas of study and bring them together is very, very hard. The language is totally different. I mean, economics is utilitarian. We're measuring costs and benefits and very consequentialist, right? Meaning that we decide what the right thing to do is by looking at the costs and benefits and calculating something, and then that's the way we should go. There's no sense of moral obligations or individual character or calling or grace or forgiveness. Like the rich Christian language that we're all very familiar with is just entirely absent. Those concepts are just not particularly economic concepts. So that is to say, most people who try to bring Christian thinking and economics together, the first few times we do it very poorly. So we try to do economics and we'll add some Bible verses in, or we'll read the Bible and we'll come to a conclusion and we'll say something very simple about economics. Doing both well is just very hard. I don't think it's that much different, say, than trying to do modern psychology and theology together. It's very difficult. very smart people working on it, but it's very difficult. Same with with biology and economics. Sorry, biology and theology. Just very different languages, very different ways of thinking, different
Yeah.
presuppositions. Yeah, I mean,
So in those various explorations that you've done, and you've intimated that some maybe at first were less successful than others have been. I mean, what for you have been some of the specific areas where you've felt that the combination of the two disciplines has really made for something significant and freshly thought for you?
well, I think there's a couple of areas where I think where there's some really important interactions and places where we kind of need both together. I've talked about environmental questions, and I know that's an area that your group is obviously passionate about. And there, I'd just point to like the first sort of account from Christian theology that I thought was really useful as an economist, that really helped me guide the way I was thinking. Is just the basic account of Christian stewardship of the natural world. It's not perfect analogy. It's not, but it gives us a way of talking about a human relationship with land and with the environment that isn't just about us using the natural world for our purposes, right? It's us interacting with the natural world for some higher purpose, and that purpose would be the purpose that God has for the created order. And just that shift of perspective is an
Mm,
immediate challenge to sort of the simple property paradigm that is sort of baked into our legal system, into our economic
mm,
thinking, into our political thinking.
mm,
And it just flips things around enough, but it is also perfectly consistent with economic logic. You're just pursuing a different set of goals.
mm,
And those fit together very nicely, and
mm,
yet it also is very powerful if you let it challenge your ideas about ownership, for example.
mm,
So
mm,
I think now that our political order is generally right to give people some broad freedom about what to do with their land, but that the Christian tradition very rightly says that we have obligations, right? That
mm,
we can't destroy the land that we're put in charge of without violating some really strong prohibitions that we should be thinking about in terms of
mm,
Christian obligations to take care of creation,
mm,
and that places some really important limits on ownership and property.
mm, mm,
Um,
yeah.
very very similarly, if we start to think about poverty, the Christian theology is quick to note that one of the purposes of the created world is to encourage the flourishing of all creatures. That includes humans, and when we start thinking about stewardship in the Old Testament theology, or we start thinking about the call that God puts in very economic terms on people,
Mm,
it's always, I have given you wealth to take
mm,
care of those people who are dependent on you or who are nearby or who find themselves
mm,
in need. So there's an implicit purpose to the material world. That is, you're
mm,
caring for those around you. And again, that just changes the nature of how we think about ownership and property. Very
mm,
fundamental kind of stuff, but it means caring for the poor isn't like a something we do if we have money left over. It's the
mm,
reason we have money in the first place,
mm,
right? So it's a reordering, I think, of the sort of the baseline priorities and purpose of what we're doing.
mm,
Um, so anyway, those are, I think, some quick examples, and
mm,
a different person would come up with different ones, I think, but those are the ones
mm,
I've been powerful for shaping my own thinking.
yeah. And hopping about a bit with the questions, in your view, is there one system of economic ordering that is more distinctively Christian than others? If you look, for instance, at capitalism as we have it at the current stage, or the sort of society that's envisaged in 1 Corinthians. Um, can it be put simply like that? Is there one system of economic ordering that's more distinctively Christian than another?
That's a hard question. I mean, I think yes, but it's hard to add a lot more without some nuance. So let me tell you how I think about the way my reading of our Christian tradition sort of interacts with economic systems. Incidentally, I mean, this question has been asked a long time. I have lots and lots of books on these shelves behind me, and a whole bunch of them go back. A lot of them are sort of mid 20th century to late 20th century of Christians very earnestly trying to figure out whether they should be capitalists or socialists, right? Because particularly in the Cold War, there's a very urgent sense that we needed to sort of work out as Christians the underlying moral order, and that those questions have not gone away. I tend to think that the more I read scripture and dig into sort of the long history of Christian thinking about economic questions, the best way to describe it is that what we get, particularly in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is not a prescription about how an economy should run, but it's a prescription about how we should live together in a particular kind of community. And it embodies certain priorities, and it puts some strong boundaries around what economic life should look like. And there's going to be some ways we could organize the economy that would run just headlong into some of those boundaries, and a Christian is just going to have to say no. So we might think it's okay to trade goods and services with money, but we're going to draw the line if you're trading human beings with money, right? That's unfortunately not across all history. Christians haven't all agreed on that, but I think we can all agree that there's the concept of the image of God and the dignity built into human beings and the sort of the long arc of Scripture bends toward a strong condemnation of anything like ownership of another human being. Similarly, obviously, I think there's strong guidance about how we relate with the natural world. There's a really strong guidance about how we should make sure that the poor and the needy and the vulnerable and the powerless are cared for in the economy, that people have the opportunity to participate in economic life the way God has called them to. But we don't have a strong call to organize the details of economic life in a particular way. We just have to make sure that we're aiming for those priorities, which is going to set boundaries around. But then a more or a less market economy with a larger welfare state, or a smaller welfare state but stronger sort of communal care for those who are in need. I think Christians can safely disagree about these things. But then there are some cases, there's some economic systems that look just really terrible, that they run into so many problems. And I think in particular the kind of state-centric versions of socialism that we saw in the Soviet Union are clearly run headlong into many more problems. It's mixed with totalitarianism. People aren't free to make the kind of decisions that they wanted to often. Concentrated government power, environmental problems stacked on top of human rights problems. So I'm not saying you can't be a Christian and also be a communist. I'm just saying it's going to be harder. Right? And I'd sort of say the same thing probably to a really strong libertarian. I don't know the ideological mixture. I can guess, but I don't know the ideological mixture of the folks, in the room here. But I think it's harder to be a real kind of anarchist libertarian and a Christian. There's a lot of qualifying you'd have to do, a whole lot of nuance to make that work. But that's just my sense. And then, I think most of Christians where we're at today is we're all living in some version of a capitalist market system. And the question is, how can we make it a little bit better? Right? Where's the room for improvement? I think there's lots of little areas we can improve, and we're always learning more about how to organize our life together so that human flourishing and the natural world are not in conflict, and that's the work.
Yeah.
Sorry, you asked me a question like that, I'm going to talk for a while because I'm paid to hear my own voice, and I expect undergraduates to take notes. If you want, I can try to be more brief. We're never going to get through all the questions.
No, well, yeah, but it is an absolutely fascinating area, and you've thought about it a lot and got lots to say. But and there are questions piling up on the chat as well, so we must give time to those. But we've still got a fair amount of time, so I do want to ask you about the whole business of everlasting growth, the concept that economies must be measured by GDP, that must evidence positive growth, and that's been held in the past necessary for the well-being of societies. And is that the best way of measuring the health of our economy, our society? Obviously, our particular program is focused on pointing people towards finding and engaging with organizations that share our vision of a non-exploitative and sustainable economy. So, how do you feel about the whole issue of growth, everlasting growth?
It's this is a great question, and this comes up a lot. I've had students, I think, grapple with this sort of immediately when they start digging into environmental economics. They realize immediately that there's a conflict between two good things in some sense. We want human beings to prosper, but the way we have prospered has caused such devastating consequences for the natural world and for other human beings that we've got to take a different path somehow. And I think, and I always caution people against saying, growth is going to solve all our problems. That's missing some things, right? There's some problems we need to deal with. On the other hand, I don't think we need to say that the solution is that economies shouldn't grow. And let me explain why. When we think about growth, it's helpful to dig a little bit into what's actually happening when the economy grows. Because sometimes what's happening is something that we can all agree is bad. An economy will grow when we chop the mountain or the top off a mountain and use a bunch of explosives to extract a whole bunch of coal. This is what we do in the U.S. and the Appalachian Mountains and sort of the eastern half of the states to get access to coal. It's cheaper to access the veins of coal if we first blow up the top of the mountain and then start digging. And then of course we take the coal and we burn it in order to create electricity. All right, so that is all great for GDP, all that stuff. But every step in that process is terrible for the natural world. It absolutely destroys the waterways and the natural environment in the Appalachians. It's terrible for the people who live nearby. The digging out of the coal is super destructive. The environment doesn't bounce back for decades. And then the burning of the coal has costs for the whole world. All right, so that's no good. But then there are other kinds of economic growth that are unambiguously a step in the right direction. So when someone does some research and develops a way of building a solar panel that uses fewer materials and lasts longer, that innovation spurs a whole bunch of growth because it allows us to produce more valuable things with fewer resources. And a lot of economic growth is caused by, little innovations like that. And a few innovations like that is what we desperately need to be able to get away from, the mountaintop, blowing up coal burning model that we've invested in the US. So, the short answer is I want more of that second kind of growth and a lot less of that first kind of growth. I would never want to say we don't want the economy to grow at all, because I would never want to say we don't want to discover new, better ways to do the things that we need to do. New medicines and new inventions and new ways of organizing ourselves to be more productive. We wouldn't want that. But at the same time, growth just lumps so much together. The way we measure GDP, we just gotta insist on pulling it apart. We want more of the good stuff and less of the bad. And that's, of course, what a lot of sort of the better metrics do. If we instead just measure, if we keep track of things about ecological sustainability, climate measures, populations of lots of different endangered species, the health of humans, right? All of these other measures of well-being aggregated just give us a better picture of what we're really aiming for when we're talking about a flourishing economy. GDP is fine for telling us whether or not we're in a recession, but it doesn't tell us if we're living better, right? So that's kind of my answer. Now, people that I trust and respect disagree with me on that growth. They would argue that there's an ideological, sort of cultural, economic, political momentum behind pursuing economic growth that's just so powerful that the only way to make environmental progress is just to turn the machine off and try something totally different. And I can respect the urgency that's reflected in that view. I don't want to give up on having better solar panels 10 years from now than we have today, because we really need a lot better solar panels, right? I want to keep moving on that front as well. So,
so there is a movement about degrowth economics, and from what you're saying, you feel that's too simplistic or not sufficiently taking into account some of the benefits of innovation. Would that be right?
Yeah, and I mean, and there's other things, and the degrowth people can be pretty nuanced and thoughtful about this. So I don't want to, in a conversation, I don't want to say, they're all wrong or something like that, because in conversation we might find that what they mean by degrowth sounds a lot like my version of nuanced growth or something of the sort, because everybody wants better solar panels, but the nuances that are important would be, and the degrowth folks would be quick to say this, that we don't want people who are currently living in absolute poverty to have to be stuck in absolute poverty. We don't want to shut the economy. We don't want to say that the steady state, or the place we're going to stop economic improvement, is right here where people like me are on top and a whole lot of other people aren't. That's not the solution. And so what they'd say is probably, we want to continue to have people around the world experience reductions in global poverty the way we've seen over the last 50 years. We want that to continue, but to make that happen and also reach our environmental goals, it probably means folks who are living relatively good lives right now are going to have to change. We are going to have to change our lives dramatically enough that the result would be economic shrinking for countries like the US, right? Where, I mean, the UK, you guys do great. I love visiting the UK, but in terms of raw use of resources, Americans are worse, right? We just burn gasoline and coal like there's no tomorrow. And so the carbon footprint per person is very, very high. And so if that's what you mean by degrowth, is that at least, there's going to have to be some leveling off there if the right policies are put in place. Yeah, actually, I could get behind that.
Yeah.
Right. That's probably right. On balance, to meet the goals that we want to meet for the climate, we probably have to put goals in place that were stringent enough that it would be pretty punishing for relatively rich countries.
Yeah. Some very interesting thoughts there. Some questions that occurred to me and have come in other talks that we've heard. If Jesus said, as he did, you cannot serve God and money, how do you have views on how Christians follow Jesus and that injunction within the demands of a modern Western economy? It's a very, very tough statement in many ways, given the way that we all live in the West anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time and place has its own pitfalls. So I think in an earlier era, if I read my history right, in the US, I would have had to be probably heroically pious or virtuous not to fall into the trap of really destructive racism. We have a dark history. Today, it's easier because I have a community that is always reminding me and helping me remember not to be racist. But it's a lot harder in this particular moment in history and time to not put too much emphasis on material things.
Mm.
We are wealthy, and that comes with certain challenges and pitfalls. So what would those pitfalls be? A guy named Craig Gay, a sociologist. Where is he working now? Somewhere in Canada. I can't remember. I'd have to go dig out the book. But he writes that the modern world's the temptation for Christians is to live as functional atheists, because we have enough control and autonomy and wealth that we can live as if we do not depend on God for anything, even though in fact we are living in a life that is entirely a gift. Right? So that one of the temptations of wealth and money is the illusion that we are in control and that we can do with it as we please. And that, that has some, I think, devotional power for me, but it also has, I think, kind of built in a kind of a systemic critique of modern life, right? The pitfalls, the errors we're going to make collectively as a society are going to be the ones that say you can do whatever you want with your money. You can be as rich as you want. It doesn't matter, right? Forget the consequences, forget the history of where it came from, and don't worry about the future because we or you are at the center of the universe. And the illusion that you deserve everything you've earned, unless something bad happens, then it's someone else's fault. Right. This is the temptation. This is the animating temptation of life for prosperous people in a capitalist world. And that is the story we have to untell as Christians over and over again when we go to church every day. Is that no, this is all a gift, and it comes within a story, and you're a character in that story, and you have a job to do, and it's not right. God gives us a lot of control to fulfill His call in a lot of different ways, in creative ways, but you can't opt out. Care for people around you, look after the world, right? Spread the gospel, live in loving community with other people, and that's what we're called to do. So at least that would be my 20th century American gloss on that particular problem. I could go, well, there's more, but that's the short version. Does that ring true for you all as well? Or would you take it a different direction? Oh, maybe I'm not allowed to turn questions around.
No. No, you are. I'm thinking through my response. Yes, I think broadly, yes. No, what you've said, I think I would agree with. We just thinking of another biblical injunction. We had an interesting discussion about what loving your neighbour means. This was at a meeting a few days ago, and whether in fact loving your neighbour includes as neighbours actually the whole of creation, animals and all that is that has been created. Would you agree with that and that sort of idea? And again, how would that impact on the way economies are ordered?
That's a softball question. I love it. I think if there's one place where humanity needs to be humbled, it's the assumption that God loves us, and He doesn't, and like the rest of creation doesn't matter. That's just not what I see in Scripture. And so I want to be careful here. First off, when the Bible says to love your neighbor as yourself, I do think probably the easiest reading of that passage is He was talking about your literal neighbor. And then it goes on and interprets it, right? We get the story of the Good Samaritan. And it's very clear that what Jesus is saying, hey, by the way, your neighbor might be someone that you don't like, and it might be someone living a little further away from you than you thought. Okay, so it's not just your friends and family, it includes everyone. I think that warns us that it's really easy for us to draw the circle of neighbors into a conveniently small community, right? The people we would care about anyway, and that Christ calls us to broaden that.
Mm.
If we add in what we get from the Old Testament in Genesis, but also in other sort of key passages where God is explicitly calling his people to live a particular way, and he keeps including animals. So there's a Sabbath. He says, be sure to everyone take a Sabbath, and while you're at it, don't forget to give your animals a break too, right? And the story of the ark, of course, he has Noah. He doesn't save most of the people, but he saves a whole bunch of the animals. Like over and over again, the biblical story sort of repeatedly clues us in to the fact that God has a story for all of creation, and we are part of it. Human beings are a uniquely important part of it, but God loves all of creation, and he has a plan for all of creation, and we ignore it at our peril. So yes, are our neighbors, the squirrels and the birds and the chrysanthemums? Undoubtedly, yes. Although, of course, we have special obligations to human beings who are nearby to us as well. I think the obligations are different but analogous. And this is what tipped me over. So I'm a vegan. I've been writing about and thinking about animal ethics for many years, and I didn't become a vegan because I was worried about climate change, and I didn't become a vegan because I liked tofu. I became a vegan because I was finally convinced by a theologian who came and gave a talk at my institution that this is what I should do to be a faithful Christian at this moment. And I went home and told my wife, and we were both very sad because I like eating meat. But we decided that this was the call, and now it's been 12 years. This is one way for, I think, me to live out that call to love all of creation in this time and place.
That's a very moving story. Thank you. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then there are so many chat questions piling up. We really must get on to listen to some of them. But
yeah, I can see them. I can see like the first 4 words or 5 words of each question when it pops up, and it's very enticing.
Just one more question before we look at questions our audience are putting.
Cool.
This was a question about the one about national debt. So campaigns to forgive national debts in the global south examples of Christian mercy, or do they undermine the international economic system?
So this is one spot where I have to say I'm talking outside my expertise a little bit. So I teach about global debt and debt relief, but I teach it at a very introductory level when I'm teaching macroeconomics to my undergraduates. And so I have a story I can tell you, but I don't pretend to know it really, really well. So let me give you a cheap answer, and that is, I can tell you a story that makes debt relief sound like exactly the right thing to do, and I might be wrong. So the story goes something like this: that after World War II, we instituted a new global financial system, and the Bretton Woods system, and we all see that system in institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And the World Bank in particular was tasked with alleviating global poverty, and they did so with a particular economic theory in mind. And that theory was that we could jumpstart growth around the world in the same way that the Marshall Plan was effective in Germany, rebuilding, Germany and Japan and other places. We just drop a whole bunch of money in, rebuild some capital, and things will start going. We thought, hey, well, maybe we could do that. Maybe we could do that in Mexico too. Why not? Let's give it a try. So we make a loan. Oh, and then the other part of the theory is, if that investment is really good, we should be able to just make a loan. They could build the capital, they get rich pretty quick, and they could pay back the loan super easy, like a loan for a house or a college loan. So that's the going theory. And it didn't work very well. I mean, it worked in some cases really well, and in a lot of cases it just didn't work well at all. The recipe we need for reduction in global poverty and economic growth in the developing world turned out to be more complicated than just investing in infrastructure. And so you have countries then that owe large amounts of money to the West because they followed their instructions and built the things they were supposed to build and enacted the policies they were supposed to enact in some cases. And it wasn't enough to make it easy to pay back said loan. And then bad things happen. And, maybe the government wasn't in a situation where they could actually, they didn't have the government capacity to keep the system up or to avoid corruption, or a natural disaster hits. In a lot of these cases, every case is different, but in a lot of these cases, it seems like it behooves us to say, you know what, this was a lot harder than we thought. And the last thing we need to do right now is have the poorer countries in the world saddled by large amounts of debt to rich countries. And so we need to try again. And the easiest way to do that is to wipe the slate and start a new program. So that's my story. John, you've probably studied this better than I have. I mean, does that sound at all plausible to you?
Yes, I think it does. I think one of the issues is that we talk about the global south, we talk about these large generalities. I think there's huge differences and huge and different issues in many different countries, and it's quite difficult actually. Although I put it that way in the question, it's quite difficult to find kind of summaries that will do justice to the many different sort of versions of the answer. I'll go on now to ask some questions people have put. So Colin McCulloch was asking, when you were talking about growth and degrowth, doesn't improved technology enabling more, quote, useful things, unquote, to be made, simply perpetuate extraction from the Earth's finite resources?
Well, it does, but it's also better. So it's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. So, for example, let's say we knew that 10 years from now we were going to build 1,000 new computers. Then at minimum, what we would want would be to do a better job building those 1,000 computers using fewer resources, and to be able to use recycled materials as much as possible, and to have a smaller carbon and energy footprint when we do it, and then to build computers that were more powerful so that we could get by with them with fewer computers to do more things. Right? That would be the goal. Now, it's a little bit of a rosy picture, because in fact, what we do is we build that better computer that's cheaper, that's smaller, uses fewer materials, et cetera, but we also build lots more of them. And here I think the key is, we know the goal is to use fewer resources in aggregate and to leave larger plots of land untouched and ecosystems, robust and safe. And we know that the total aggregate amount of consumption that we're doing in manufacturing and extraction is just too much. So we have to enact policies that give us the incentive to make those improvements, but also give us the incentive to just sort of draw back on our total footprint on the planet in aggregate. And there's different ways we could do that, but the kind of policies that are this kind of the low-hanging fruit policies would be just to tax the use of a lot of these raw materials, would be to protect large amounts of land that we know are critical for ecosystems and habitats that we need to protect, and just make it very expensive to do the part of that manufacturing of more consumable goods that involves the most environmentally destructive stuff. And then once we put enough of those boundaries in place and make it really expensive to do things sort of the old-fashioned way, then that gives firms the incentive to make that new computer, sure, but use a lot more recycled materials, keep their carbon footprint low, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not great at putting those policies into place, but that's the dream. Yeah.
Thank you. Rob Wakeling asks, and this may be a question more oriented towards the UK. The US situation may or may not be different, but his question is, how can we persuade conservative evangelical Christians that addressing the climate and ecological emergency should be a priority? I belong, he says, to a church where proclaiming Christ seems to exclude much mention of these emergencies.
Yeah. Hey, I'm right in the same spot. I live in a relatively politically conservative part of the country. Michigan is pretty mixed, but West Michigan isn't. And I grew up among evangelical Christians for whom environmentalists were among the enemies. So I kind of have a foot in both worlds, and I don't love at all that my brothers and sisters in Christ are sort of not on the same page with me on this. And there are some reasons for it. The environmental movement has for a long time framed itself as being at odds with Christianity, because Christianity has ideologically been wedded to capitalism and extraction and hierarchy and whatnot. And I don't think those bad things are essential to Christianity, but that's where we're at. And so the lines were drawn. So when I talk to evangelicals, so let me frame it in a positive way. When I talk to my friends and family and students that consider themselves conservative evangelicals, there's ways of framing environmental concern and climate change in particular that are better, and there's some that are worse. So, for instance, I'm not gonna lead off with population control. That's gonna be a bad way to start, because well, anyway. But I might not lead off with saying that what we need to do is have government have more control of the economy or something of the sort. That's going to be a red flag. But we can go to the Bible and say, you know what, here's some things that we both care about. We both know that God loves creation and has a plan for it. We know we need to care for future generations. That responsibility for our children and our grandchildren is just sort of baked into the ethos of the community I grew up in. You can talk to farmers and who are in my part of the country, often conservative evangelical Christians, and you can talk to them about preserving the land for their kids and making changes so that the waterways can support fish and life still, and and these kinds of things, and they're 100% in on that. If you talk about climate change right away, they'll clam up. But if you talk about preserving the land, so that it's that the livestock is healthy, and that we're not getting sick and all these kinds of things, and that there's fish living in the local stream again, yeah, they're 100% on board. And the language of stewardship is very powerful, and it resonates. I could go on, but it's a difficult task because of the way political lines are drawn. But Christian language can be a kind of a bridge between different political communities. It was for me, right? I can talk through that story, and I've given you a hint of that. But I can have that conversation with people and say, you know what, I agree with all this stuff, and here's what changed my mind, right? Here's the reason why I live the way I do and why I care about the things that I do, and it's because I take the Bible seriously, and that has some weight as well. It's no guarantees, but
yeah. Thank you. Tim Cooper's got a question. It may be that he will need to unmute to give you some examples of this. His question is, traditional economics uses many unrealistic assumptions in generating and applying its theories. Do you recognize this? And if so, how do you address it in your teaching? And there's a subordinate question, what do you think of behavioral economics? Would you like Tim to expand that, or does that give you enough to go on?
No, I think I can. Let me try to answer it, and if I need some, Tim, you can pitch in if I don't quite hit it right. Okay. So economists we're famous for making unrealistic assumptions. So as an example, economists often assume in our models of human behavior that individuals will act rationally to pursue particular goals subject to constraints that they're facing. And this is baked into our models of consumer behavior and labor supply. So, when people are deciding whether or not to go to work and what to buy, and all these kinds of things. And these assumptions are unrealistic in the sense that we know that actual individuals don't always make decisions that seem at all consistent with the assumptions. And that's a problem, and it's not a problem, depending on the situation. I can talk about that. But let me just add in, behavioral economics is definitely relevant here because the movement to embrace what we call behavioral economics is it's a move to try to bring empirical psychology into the discipline as a way of saying, hey, look, we know that people actually seem to make decisions this way in a consistent fashion when they're faced with this kind of risk. They seem to respond not the way economists describe, but this other way. And so then behavioral economists will say, well, let's take that new rule for how humans behave and see if it changes the way we do economics. And that can be very helpful. And in some cases, particularly with dealing with uncertainty and loss, behavioral economics and some other kinds of decision making, some social interaction, some behavioral economics has just been very innovative and very helpful for economists explaining some things we couldn't explain well before using our models. Okay, so I think that's the setup. Does that sound right, Tim? Does that fit your? Okay. So my response is that a good economist is always using an imperfect model, but uses it carefully enough that it doesn't lead him or her astray. But there's definitely some judgment, because any model is like a thought experiment for a philosopher. You're always saying, hey, here's a complicated problem. Let me see if I can whittle it down into a simple enough terms that we can really get to the problem we're trying to examine and make some predictions or think through the implications. Now, if you whittle a problem down to some sort of unrealistically simple character and then draw conclusions that are inappropriate because you assumed away the problem, you've done it wrong. So there are a lot of situations in economics where rational behavior makes a lot of sense. It turns out that when we're talking about investors trying to decide where to put their money, assuming that they're going to try to buy stocks and bonds that will give them a certain return and minimize a certain amount of risk, that's not a bad description of actually most investors' behavior, right? Those are the things often that they care about. They might not do it well. There's good investors and there's bad investors, and we make mistakes and we can't see the future. But at least that set of motivations, that's pretty close. And there's a lot of firms where when you ask them, how are you deciding where to buy the raw materials that you're using to make your goods, they'll say, well, I'm looking for reliability and low price, which is basically what the model would predict. And so in that case, again, our models are probably doing okay. But when we start trying to model something like the interaction between parents and children, if we assume it's a bargaining game in which parents are trying to figure out how to interact with their children in such a way that they'll maximize the amount of money their children will pay for them in their retirement home, right, 50 years later, and we're probably straining credibility a bit. Like most parents and children, they're not negotiating about, future income. they're just trying to live together in a, in a family together in a way that they can support each other and love each other and also deal with each other's weaknesses. So I hope that gives you a sense that I don't have a huge problem teaching standard economics, with the caveat that I hope I'm teaching my students to use it intelligently and to recognize when we're pushing those assumptions into domains where they just don't make sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question from Colin, which is really about usury, the fact that the Bible speaks strongly against it and, in a sense, forbids any level of interest on a loan. So in economic terms, interest is inherently extractive, and this drives or requires growth, or else inequality goes to infinity in time without redistribution, e.g. through tax. So money loans a fundamentally unchristian thing. Is that clear? Or if not, we can bring Colin to just kind of clarify and summarize that.
Again, let me take a stab at it, and I'm happy to be corrected if I miss the mark. So the Christian tradition is very consistent in condemning charging interest on loans. If you go to the Old Testament, very, very explicitly, people in the Israelite community were condemned from charging loans against other people in the community. I think maybe you could charge interest on loans to Gentiles or people. I can't remember. I'd have to go check that up. But this was consistent across the ancient world. So if you look at the ancient Greeks, they're convinced that charging interest on loans is clearly immoral. And if you go through the Roman period and the early church and the medieval scholars, oh yeah, charging interest on loans is clearly a problem. A lot of historians will tell us that the frequency with which sermons were levied against charging interest on loans is probably a good signal that it was done all of the time anyway, but that at least Christians were supposed to feel really guilty about it. Okay. So how do we deal with that in the modern sort of financialized economy in which, interest on loans is just everywhere? It is unavoidable unless you want to extract yourself entirely from life. Well, it's worth noting a couple of things here, and I don't think I've totally resolved this question. I teach the history of economic thinking to my students, and I have them grapple with this, and I can resolve about 3/4 of the dilemma in my mind. And the resolution for me goes something like this. First off, in the ancient world, when someone charged a loan, they were almost always charging or giving a loan. When they give a loan to someone, it was largely because that person who needed the loan had suffered some misfortune, and they needed some support to survive. So the kinds of loans that you were required to give to your neighbor in the Old Testament were loans because your neighbor's farm had not produced food, and their family was going to starve if you didn't give them a loan or let them jumpstart their herd again, right? Loan them some animals. Well, so that's kind of a humanitarian impulse. And it's an impulse, and it's a loan of consumption where if you were to charge a high rate of interest, you would be using your more powerful economic position to exacerbate their poverty. So there was a very real kind of way of oppressing the poor, which would be to charge interest that would ensure that they would continue to be in poverty, and your wealth would grow and theirs would shrink. That is largely the context for a lot of loans through much of the ancient world. And the moment that Christian thinking starts to shift on charging interest is the moment in which loans start being used to a large degree between people who are wealthy, and the loan is financing an investment. Now, you can go into the Middle Ages and there's a lot of messiness, and you can see Christians sort of grappling. Is it okay, for a loan for investment purposes, and when is it okay? And it's really fascinating stuff. But the shift happens when some kind of commercialized finance sort of starts to become the norm, and then Christians realize, wait a second, when this rich person gives a loan to that rich person to fund some kind of business venture, that looks different. Like, it doesn't look like anyone's taking advantage of someone's need or taking advantage of someone in poverty. And so the economic context of borrowing and lending is shifting. Now, if you take that, and I think that's okay. I don't think one business borrowing from another business to finance an investment is morally problematic. But if you take that dichotomy or that difference, that shift over time, we can still apply sort of both models to life today, and you could still say that somebody going up to somebody who's in poverty and saying, "Hey, look, I'll give you this credit card application with a $10,000 or 10,000 pound credit limit, and I know you're in great need. Because you're in great need, I'm probably going to need to charge. You're kind of a credit risk, so I'm going to charge you 25% interest per year." Like, that feels exploitative in kind of exactly the same way that the Bible would condemn. But at the same time, a small business loan or the loan that I took out to buy my house doesn't feel exploitative, right? I could have spent my whole life saving to buy my house, but I didn't want to. I wanted to live in the house right away, and so taking out a 30-year loan. Oh, it just occurred to me that this might be touching a little too close to home for those of you in the UK. Home loans are absolutely out of control around London, and I've heard rumors of like 100-year loans, and yeah, anyway, property is a mess. But at least for me, it doesn't feel exploitative when I took out a home loan, and I'll have it paid off in 15 years, and I feel like that's kind of very reasonable. But that doesn't mean that there isn't times and places in the modern world in which debt is exploitative. Now, that doesn't get at the part of the question that's asking about it doesn't quite get at the question about whether or not, charging interest sort of inevitably results in inequality, absent redistribution. That's a bit more complicated. I don't think that debt financing with interest is on face a problem. Growing inequality is a problem, and redistribution, I think, is if we do it smart, is a natural response, particularly for caring for those who've suffered grave misfortune. I think a kind of a safety net is just obvious. And having folks who are particularly wealthy pay a disproportionate share to fund that safety net, I think, makes a lot of sense. I don't think we need, other than cases of exploitation or sort of exploitative, kind of oppressive payday lending in the United States is an issue. I don't think we need to look at the financial system too critically as causing that inequality, but I say that with a bad taste in my mouth. There are lots of things I'd change about our financial system. I just don't think charging interest is sort of at the root of the problem. But I could be corrected on that, and I'd be happy to, go back and forth.
May I just come back on that, John? Or
yes, Colin, yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, Stephen, what I'm referring particularly to work by people like David Graeber, who you presumably know or know of, and the idea of the sort of the R, and Thomas Piketty, the R greater than G idea, that if the growth rate is less than the interest rate, the average interest rate in the market, then actually what happens is that those with capital accumulate more and more, because the production of the macroeconomic level, the production is inadequate to produce the return on that production, which pays the loans. So then you get this. That's why I say it goes to infinity if you run it for a long time, and perhaps sometimes goes very fast in that direction, particularly if you have a recession or something. And that's one problem. So there's the inequality thing that requires redistribution, which effectively means that the loan income has to be taxed at a rate, or the wealth accumulated thereby has to be taxed at the rate that actually gives it back to the people who paid it by one means or another. So why did you charge it in the first place? Okay, that's one question. And then the other question is that the production itself, the G figure in that inequality, that G is bigger or less than the interest rate, the growth element is a necessity unless R is 0. So if if you actually don't want to have growth because it's going to ruin the planet and make it unlivable, as many of us now have concluded, at least in Western economies, then actually you should never be charging interest through this whole financial system, because the banks are creating the money, creating the loans, and just extracting from that and producing nothing of any value that adds to human flourishing. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from. That's my thinking at the moment.
This is really good. That's a very elegant critique of the broader system, and it's not one that I have thought about in enough depth to be super confident in my response. But I do have a kind of an intuition that I'll offer you on this one, and that is that economists often want to separate production from distribution, or allocation from distribution, which is a way of saying that we want to allocate our resources and our effort and our time and our money into the places where they'll do the most good. But that we can separate that from the distribution of economic benefits and wealth overall. Now we separate allocation from distribution. One of the ways we do that is through redistribution, through the welfare state and through government services and these kinds of things. I think it's really important to recognize that there are elements of our modern economic system that tend toward concentration, and that if we're going to emphasize that efficient allocation of resources, this is one of the things where I think charging interest is an elegant system for making sure that our investment dollars are going to the places where they'll get a good return, which is to say that they're going toward business ventures that have a reasonable chance of success. That's a thing we want to happen by and large, assuming that we're also putting some boundaries around the business ventures so that the success that they reap is also a success that we want to happen, right? And which is a bigger systemic reform. But then we can't separate that from the need to also be continually investing in people's ability to participate productively in said system and having a chance to reap those rewards, and then also redistributing and having a safety net. And so there's all these places where we want to sort of create sort of natural channels in which that productive capacity, which sometimes gets concentrated because someone produces a really great drug and we give them a patent on it and they get insanely wealthy in 2 years. Lilly in the United States right now is just drowning in money from this weight loss drug. We don't want them to not produce those weight loss drugs. We might reform the patent system, but we do want natural channels where that wealth automatically gets spread around. And there's very reasonable places to do that. And this is 20th century social democracy. I'm not saying anything innovative that surprises any of you, but I think that is the right balance, because it does allow for both the reinvestment if we're doing it right, but also it allows the firms to have the incentive to do, and commercial ventures and entrepreneurs to do great things when they have the idea and to distribute things widely relatively quickly. Honestly, if we want globalization, and there's some benefits to being able to have move people and goods and services around the world, we're going to have to deal with that. There's just even more concentration of wealth, and so I think we have to be comfortable with channels of automatic investment in people. Education, healthcare, healthy communities, safety nets. I don't know if you like the answer, but I think that's the answer. I actually don't think G should get down to 0. We've talked about that a little bit. I think it should be lower, but we disagree maybe on what the optimal rate would be if everything was right. But I also don't want the return on capital to be 0. I want the return on capital to be high on average. Whether that's funneled through loans, I don't really care. It could be the return on stock market investments or other forms of financing. But you're right. If we're going to have a low growth rate and a high return on capital, then we have to have the institutions that spread around the wealth, right? High estate taxes, capital gains taxes, corporate taxes, free public education, right? You go down the list. I mean, that just seems like a no-brainer to me. And then the question is that adequate? Maybe that's not enough. I don't know.
I think this is a discussion we could continue to have for many hours, but we are running near to the end of the time we can reasonably ask of you. And I just wanted to ask you one last question, if I may, before we finish. There are all sorts of economic issues at present, problems with the creation of money and many concerns about the global economy. What gives you hope at present in our world order?
This is a good question. I just saw a question about a global wealth tax pop up. Oh, it's so tempting. I'd love to have a global wealth tax. I don't know how to implement it, but that doesn't give me hope. That just makes me despair that I don't know how to implement a global wealth tax. Let me see. So, all right, little things give me hope. There's a movement around the globe right now to carve out huge amounts of land to protect biodiversity. 5 years ago, I never would have guessed that would have been an international priority. I don't know if we'll succeed, but I'm convinced that one of the few things that we could do that we really could afford, it'd be expensive, but one of the few things we really could afford to do that would be a gift to people 100 years from now, to the whole planet 100 years from now, is to just carve out large amounts of land and say, we're going to leave it alone. And we're not going to build here. And because the biodiversity decline, right up there with climate change, are the two things that really do worry me about, what the world is going to be like 50 or 100 years from now. The numbers are very alarming. That gives me hope. The other one is, honestly, I did not think, this tells you something about it, maybe how pessimistic I would have been a decade ago. But I did not think that we would have seen the kind of, I would have expected more policy response, and I would have expected less technological change that looks really promising. So I don't think I could have predicted the degree to which solar panels have become cheaper in the last decade. It's wild. We could now talk about having enough solar panels. Don't get me started on how expensive it would be to manufacture these and the disposal, but it's better than coal. We can now talk about having enough solar panels to actually provide us with the electricity we would need in the US. It'd be expensive, but it's a math problem that we can solve on a napkin. And a decade ago, it would have broken the system. The fact that we can now take soybeans and peas and other kinds of things, and we can make hamburgers out of plants without turning them into a cow first. I didn't see that one coming, but but you roll that sort of agricultural technology out a decade, and there's the real chance that we could cut meat consumption in the next couple of decades rather than seeing it inevitably grow, which is a huge cost on the environment. People building energy or getting energy out of the movement of waves, right? These sorts of things. I mean, these things are great, and so you start to see the pieces in place that we would need to make a transition if we had the political will to do it. And once you have the pieces, once the roadmap is there, I don't believe that my leaders here in the United States are going to make good decisions. They can't. I mean, it's bleak. But at least today, unlike a decade ago, I can see the path from here to where we want to go. Because a whole lot of individuals in their own little spots, in their own little labs, on their farms, right? Oh, one more. There's these folks in Kansas, Nebraska. They're growing perennial wheat. So they're growing wheat that with roots that go down 2 meters that you can harvest. You can harvest without killing the wheat plant and replanting it. I mean, little things it's in terms of the cost on the land from having to replant and harvest and retill and replant every year is huge. But if we could have grain plants where we were harvesting every year without having to replant, and the root system grows, and so you don't have to water it or fertilize it as much, right? The resource reductions there, it's wonderful. So anyway, those are the little things, all the little things coming together that do give me hope.
Thank you. Yeah.
That there's a possibility for things not to be terrible.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you so much for your time with us, and we've really enjoyed your views. You've given us lots of thoughts and insights that we want to take away and think about. So we're really grateful. Thank you very much for being with us, and hope the rest of your day is good.